worry about going on the train, you'll like the train. Don't worry about it. Before you know it, you'll be asleep in your aunt's house. All your troubles will be over. So eat your Coney Island.
She don't even know me.
Well, she's gonna know you now.
She ain't gonna want me.
You're making trouble for her. She hasn't even seen you yet.
She never even cared for my mom.
Nobody didn't care for your mama.
And she was her sister.
Your mama was a fine woman.
Everybody says she was.
Well, everybody don't know your mama, do they?
How could you know my mama?
Good enough to know you can be real proud of the happiness she give to people. Now, eat your Coney Island.
You meet my mom in a barroom?
Where would you get a question like that?
I hear Miss Polly talk to the neighbor lady. Says one if he was my pa.
Well, don't the world have a wild imagination? Eat your Coney Island.
You my pa?
Of course I ain't your pa. I'll get you some relish. Coney Island ain't no good without relish. Look, I know how you feel. I lost my ma, too. I even lost my pa. I don't even know where my sister is. I wish I could tell you I'm your pa, but it just ain't like that.
You met her in a barroom.
Just because a man meets a woman in a barroom don't mean he's your pa. Eat your Coney Island.
What's up, film fans? Happy New Year. This is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter, and I'm Aaron Hunter, and I did not expect this to be my first video of 2022. I'm currently working on a video about diegetic music and sound in film, and that should be up in the next few days, but while I was editing that, the news came in that filmmaker Peter Bogdanovich had passed away. So I thought I'd come on here and just say a few words about him. He's a complicated and compelling figure, and I have a kind of personal tie to or investment in his career, not as a friend or anything like that. So I thought I'd say a few things. While I was researching for this, we got the news that Sidney Poitier had passed away. Poitier was perhaps a more significant figure in Hollywood history, certainly a more significant cultural figure than Bogdanovich. And he will be the subject of numerous videos and obituaries and eulogies and awards, as he should be. Not just an outstanding performer, but a civil rights worker, an advocate, and just a kind of great inspiration to a lot of Americans and people around the world. I did do a video about a year ago on Poitier's film In the Heat of the Night, in which I talked quite a bit about his performance. I also talked quite a bit in there about how that was one of the first Hollywood films to really try to understand how to light a black performer, particularly for scenes shot at night, and the great work of Haskell Wexler and his kind of collaboration with Poitier on that film. And you can check that out here. But mainly I want to talk about Bogdanovich. Who was Peter Bogdanovich? If you're watching my channel, if you're watching this video, you're probably pretty familiar with him. But I do have quite a few younger viewers. I have quite a few viewers from outside the United States who might not know that much about him. And I don't want to talk a lot about his personal life, although of all the directors from the 1970s, for Bogdanovich perhaps, the intertwining of his personal and professional reputation is quite intricate and intimate, and so it will come up a little bit. Who was he? First of all, he was a director. He directed his first feature film in 1968 and continued to direct features and documentaries up until just a couple years ago when he put out a documentary on Buster Keaton. And he was an excellent director. He was also a performer, and he was also kind of a popular historian of Hollywood history, particularly classical Hollywood history from kind of the late 20s through the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. And he was also in several high-profile relationships, including with Polly Platt. And I should say at the start of this that I have spent the last 6 years researching and writing a book about Polly Platt, which is coming out, I think, next month. So I'm kind of intimately familiar with their story, particularly professionally speaking. And you know, as a sort of Platt scholar, I'll try not to let that color the things I'm about to say. As a popular historian, Bogdanovich wrote over 10 books and published over 10 books. One of the best known, and one that I highly recommend, came in the late 90s. It's called Who the Devil Made It. It's actually a series of interviews with Hollywood directors, mostly from the classical era. So you get Howard Hawks, Otto Preminger, you get Frank Tashlin, Fritz Lang, George Cukor, and Alfred Hitchcock, and a few slightly more contemporary directors kind of from Bogdanovich's generation, Don Siegel and Sidney Lumet. It's a great book because it really shows you, I mean, it's interviews, but it really shows you Bogdanovich's deep knowledge of classical Hollywood filmmaking and his kind of reverence or love for it. So I highly recommend that. As a performer, he acted throughout most of his career. He was a trained actor. He trained with Stella Adler in New York City. And he's in his first feature film, Targets, where he has a prominent role as a kind of Bogdanovich-like young director in Hollywood in the Boris Karloff stream of that film. He did voiceover. He played the DJ in several of his films, but also he's the DJ in both parts of Tarantino's Kill Bill. And he acted on television as well. He's probably best known to people as the sort of shrink's shrink on The Sopranos. He's Dr. Malfi's psychiatrist in, 10, 12, 15 episodes of The Sopranos. So he performed throughout his life. He's also in Orson Welles' The Other Side of the Wind, that sort of great work that Orson Welles never finished in his lifetime, that was filmed in the early to mid 70s and came out a couple years ago on Netflix. And Bogdanovich plays a role that was written for him by Welles, which is sort of a sycophantic, exaggerated version of Bogdanovich himself. But mainly, of course, he's known as a movie director, and he was a great director. And the reception of Bogdanovich as a director, as I said, is kind of intimately tied with his personal life. He put his personal life on display. He was very open about it, especially in the 70s, where he was not just a filmmaker and performer and writer, but a kind of media figure. I mean, he used to fill in for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. And because of that, in a lot of ways, I think his reputation as a filmmaker is colored by his reputation as a person. And I never knew him as a person. I don't pretend to know the inner workings of Peter Bogdanovich's brain or heart, but we can kind of look at how he performed in public, his persona, let's say, and the way it tracks with his reputation or his reception as a filmmaker. And there are a few things that happened in the early 70s that kind of set the foundation for, I would say, his reputation or his reception throughout the rest of his life. First of all, he exploded on the scene as one of the great filmmakers of the early New Hollywood era. His first film as a director, his first feature film anyway as a director, Targets, didn't make a huge splash, but his second film, and it's a great film by the way, but his second film, The Last Picture Show, I mean, it's hard to kind of overstate how profoundly praised that movie was. It was compared to Citizen Kane. He was compared to Orson Welles. It received a slew of Academy Award nominations and a couple Performance Academy Awards, and he was feted around Hollywood and the country as the next big thing. And it can be hard, I think, for younger people or even people who lived through it to sort of realize that in the early to mid 70s, Bogdanovich was considered one of the greatest young American filmmakers. When Charles Bluedorn from Paramount decided he wanted to put together a director's company, a small group of sort of independent-minded studio filmmakers who would use the director's company to make films of their vision, their personal films, the three people he turned to were Francis Ford Coppola, William Friedkin, and Peter Bogdanovich. And Paper Moon is a director's company film. He was huge, and he made 4 films: Targets, The Last Picture Show, What's Up Doc, and Paper Moon. And All of those films are fantastic. If for some reason he had died in 1974 or decided to move to an ashram and give up filmmaking or to an island in the Pacific, his reputation as a filmmaker would still stand. It might even be bigger because of those 4 films. They're that good. And then he put out 2 bombs, 2 flops, Daisy Miller and At Long Last Love. And those films are undergoing a small but kind of vocal reassessment. I don't think that they're necessarily great films, although there are great things about them. But they dented his reputation. So what? New York, New York dented Scorsese's reputation. A lot of the filmmakers of the 70s put out films that dented their reputation and rebounded. Sometimes with small personal films like Raging Bull. Sometimes with big, important films. Sometimes it took them a long time. Altman's career kind of died off in the 80s, and then he came back and had a huge 90s and early 2000s. And now he's Altman. He gets known by his last name. But something else happened with Bogdanovich around the time he made those 2 flops. And I think there are 2 things. And one is the story that's often told. And it's the one that's kind of intimately connected with me. And that's the story of Polly Platt. And like I said, I don't want to go too much into his personal life, but Bogdanovich was married to Platt in the early 60s. They were married for about 10 years. They struggled as artists in New York, working in the theater, putting on movie exhibitions, and then they packed everything into their car and drove out to California. This is a pretty well-known story, and struggled and got to know some of the classical Hollywood greats, and then finally broke into the movies with Roger Corman, like so many of their contemporaries did. He gave them the chance to make targets, and then they made The Last Picture Show. And on those first 4 films, Polly Platt was intimately involved. She was the production designer, she was the costume designer, she was the location scout and manager. On some of them, she did hair and makeup, and she contributed to the writing. When you look at those 4 films, much of what you see on screen was put there by Polly Platt. And they had an amazing collaborative relationship. And if you listen to Platt, even later in her life, after the kind of acrimony of the divorce, they still maintained a relationship because they had 2 daughters that they kind of co-parented in a Hollywood way. But if you listen to Platt talking about Bogdanovich in the 2000s, she still, all the water under the bridge, celebrates the collaborative nature of that relationship. And so did Bogdanovich up through the 90s and into the early 2000s. So if you listen to the DVD commentary, his director's commentary on something like Paper Moon, he sort of lavishes Platt with praise for the work that she did on that film. And then they split up. First they divorced, they did a couple more films, What's Up Doc and Paper Moon, and then that was it. And they didn't work on films together anymore. And then he had 2 bombs. And so there was a whisper campaign around Hollywood for many years that maybe it was Polly Platt who was responsible for the greatness of those first 4 films. And that remained kind of a whisper campaign, not even a campaign, just a, shop talk. Until the late 90s, when Peter Biskind put out his book, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, in which he kind of throws that argument out for all to see. And, he quotes Ben Johnson saying that Platt directed Last Picture Show just as much as Bogdanovich. And that story has grown. And you'll see this in comments on Bogdanovich's death. If you read obituaries just from over the weekend, in the comments, people will say, well, Polly Platt was really responsible. Polly Platt did a hell of a lot on those films. They are as good as they are, in part because of her. Also in part because of Laszlo Kovacs, who was the cinematographer on most of Bogdanovich's early films. Also because of the editing of Verna Fields, who did editing and in some cases sound editing on most of his films in the 60s and 70s. They were highly collaborative affairs. And if you listen to Bogdanovich in interviews and in these DVD commentaries, he's very open about that. He praises Platt, but he also praises Verna Fields all the time. If you listen to him talk about the scene in Paper Moon when the O'Neills Addie and Mose have been arrested, and she's got the money in her headband, and there's something like, I don't remember exactly, but like 25 camera setups in that scene because they wanted it to appear intense for the two protagonists. So every cut is from a different angle, and he talks about how good Verna Fields was at stitching that all together, you know. So those early films were really collaborative affairs, and I'm a person, if you watch my channel, you know, who believes strongly in the sort of collaborative nature of filmmaking. So you know, that's not a surprise to me. But the thing is, after At Long Last Love, Bogdanovich made a couple really good films, perhaps not as great as the first four, but Saint Jack, which he made in 1979 with Ben Gazzara, and They All Laughed from 1981, those are good, interesting films. And after that, he made Mask, which is not my favorite one of his films, but it was quite a big success. Stunning performances by Cher and Eric Stoltz. It's maybe dated in the way a lot of those 1980s sort of films about the physically and mentally disabled are, and that kind of, we're all good inside and that just makes everything okay sort of way. But it was a popular success. And he's made at least a few other good films since then. This film he made in the early 90s called A Thing Called Love, which is the last film, I think the last completed performance of River Phoenix. It's also got Samantha Mathis and Sandra Bullock in an early role about songwriters trying to break into songwriting in Nashville. It's a lovely little film. It's funny and touching, and the music is great. It's a really well-made and adorable film. And then he also made The Cat's Meow in 2001, which is a really great film. It's based on a true story that's based on a rumor about the death of Thomas Ince, this kind of early classical era, or silent era really, movie producer who died on the yacht of William Randolph Hearst. That really happened. And then the film takes a story that Orson Welles told Bogdanovich, speculating about how Ince died. And it's a lovely little film, great performances. It has Kirsten Dunst playing maybe her first adult role as Marion Davies, the same character that was played by Amanda Seyfried in Mank last year. Old school Edward Herrmann playing Hearst. Eddie Izzard has a great performance as Charlie Chaplin, who was on the yacht. And Carrie Elways, As You Wish, plays Ince. Jennifer Tilly plays Luella Parsons, the great sort of Hollywood gossip. And it's a lot of fun, and it's a really well-made, well-shot, well-designed, and wonderfully performed film. And that's the thing about Bogdanovich. He was a good director. He was particularly good with actors. So if you look at something like The Last Picture Show, you've got this sort of cadre of young actors, some of them with a bit of experience, like Timothy Bottoms and Jeff Bridges, and some with no experience, like Sybil Shepherd. And then this other group of sort of theatrically trained performers, some of whom are making their first films: Ellen Burstyn, Eileen Brennan, Cloris Leachman, and then these old school Hollywood hands like Ben Johnson. And somehow he manages to bring these three different groups together and get this incredibly organic ensemble performance. That's directing in part. He recognized talent really well. He kind of discovered Madeline Kahn as again a theater performer, and brought her into movies and put her in a ton of movies, including What's Up Doc, At Long Last Love, Paper Moon, she's great. And he understood actors and how they worked, and that different actors needed different approaches. One of my favorite things he said, which is just a little thing, but I think gives some insight into his understanding of acting and of talent. When The Cat's Meow came out, he was often asked to compare Kirsten Dunst with Sybil Shepherd. They're both 19 at the time of filming, and so people would ask him, was there any similarities? And Bogdanovich would say, no. Kirsten Dunst is amazing. She's a performer. She had years of experience at that point, and she knew how the camera worked. She knew how to act with other people. She was great with the older cast, the younger cast, and so on. And he's like, I didn't have to teach her anything like I had to teach Sybil Shepherd. I just had to direct her. And I think that gives a little insight into his awareness as a director of how different performers needed different approaches. He was also fantastic in terms of film composition. Yes, he worked with a lot of great cinematographers, including repeatedly the great Laszlo Kovacs. But if you look at his films, starting with Targets, there is a fluidity of camera that seems very organic, but there's also a great sense of how camera framing and camera movement can further the story, how it can create a tension on screen with what the performers are doing or what the narrative's telling us. And that talent for framing and for movement extends throughout, even in some of the lesser films like At Long Last Love, which I don't like, I know a lot of you love it, is a beautifully made film, and the camera work in that film is exquisite. So even in his bombs, there are interesting things happening. So we can look at this kind of story which says Polly Platt was responsible for everything great about those films, and we can recognize that yes, she was responsible for a lot of what was great about those films, but she didn't direct the cast. She didn't put the camera down, move the camera, push the camera, pull the camera, focus the camera, and so on. She didn't make those decisions. She's amazing at what she does, and what she does needs to be better understood, and what production designers do and what non-directors do, editors and writers and costume designers and so on, needs to be better understood if we want to have a fuller picture of how Hollywood filmmaking works. I think Polly Platt's one of the most influential filmmakers in the last 50 years of Hollywood history. So I don't mean to underplay what she did, but she didn't direct the films. And I think that framing comes out of a kind of an apparatus, or as I call it, a paradigm that actually affected Bogdanovich's reputation as dramatically as the separation from Platt. And that's the auteur paradigm. Bogdanovich, as much as, or maybe more than any of those other filmmakers in the 70s, took on the mantle of the auteur. And he really believed in the idea that, up till the end, that the director was the creative, the sole font of creative genius, of creativity, of imaginative power on a film set, despite the very collaborative nature of his filmmaking. And there was a time after he'd been invited to join the director's company, after he had one hit after another, where I think, again, I don't know the inner workings of his heart and mind, Bogdanovich became more interested in being an auteur than he did in being a director. And he came to the belief for a while, and I think he flirted with it throughout his career, that because he was an auteur, his films were going to be good. And so that although he directed them, he didn't kind of direct them. Having Polly Platt around to be a sounding board, to tell him when he was full of it, to suggest alternate ideas and so on, of course was important, but he would surround himself with creatives throughout his life. It's just that sometimes I think his sense of himself as an auteur got in the way of his work as a director. And also, without getting too personal, his sense of his own importance. Bogdanovich loved to talk about Bogdanovich. And all of his stories, even when he's praising someone else, within them there's a sort of hint of, or a sign that he's kind of also praising himself right now. And so while he exploded on the scene with The Last Picture Show, made these other great films, he enjoyed talking about that greatness a lot. So when he put out two bombs, I think something else happened besides just the fact that Polly wasn't there, which is that the great auteur has fallen. And Americans, the American press, the Hollywood press loves to smell blood in the water. And there was a sense that, oh, this guy got too big for his britches and now we're going to tear him apart. And it took a long time for his films to recover because of that. So I think by the time we get to St. Jack and They All Laughed, his reputation was already so damaged that they didn't get looked at the way they deserved to be. And I think the same thing's true later with A Thing Called Love and The Cat's Meow. These are great films that I think should have done better. They have stellar performances, beautiful young casts who were like hot and hip at the time that they were put out, plus old hands that do turn in these great performances. And they're wonderfully made and they tell incredible stories. But I think his reputation was already sort of at the point where if he didn't turn out another picture show, he hadn't recovered as an auteur. And I think it's worth thinking about that because he kind of brought that on himself, and it ties back into the Polly Platt stuff in a way that is ironic and unfortunate, which is that once Biskind put out this idea, or it's not even Biskind's fault, but once the idea became more widespread that she co-directed the first 4 films, I think as much as that sort of damaged, I don't even think it really damaged his reputation, but I think it damaged his own sense of himself as an auteur. Because if one accepts the auteur paradigm, one accepts that it's only the director. And now, if someone else is getting credit for directing, the auteurism goes away. Right? I think if Bogdanovich is out there in the 80s and 90s talking about the great work Platt's done, and everyone's like, Polly Platt did this, and Polly Platt did that, and Verna Fields did this, and Laszlo Kovacs did that, and these performances, he's happy with that. But in Hollywood, in film studies, we don't have yet an adequate apparatus for discussing creative talent behind the camera that doesn't tie into auteurism. And so when people look at Platt's contribution to those films, it's not enough for some reason to say she was a fantastic visual artist whose production design, costume design, location work, and so on created the kind of mise-en-scène of those films, which is what production designers and costume designers and location managers do. We have to somehow take that talent of hers and push it into a director's box. And that's because auteurism has so kind of crippled or blinded our way of thinking about filmmaking that that's the only way we can really kind of recognize her genius. And so by calling her a director, we're actually taking away from Bogdanovich's own creativity instead of looking at how they complement each other, right? And he became quite sort of crotchety about this later over the last several years. He said some very cruel things about her in an interview a couple years ago, and I think it's because this kind of got to him. So it's a complex phenomenon that happened with his reputation and his career, is that he bought into auteurism so strongly that when the auteurism was diminished, that's what kind of diminished the career, I think, or that's what diminished his conception of his own career, maybe. I'm not sure. Like I said, I don't know him. What I do know is that he was a fantastic filmmaker, and he made 3 stone cold classics in Picture Show, What's Up Doc, and Paper Moon, and several other very good films, the ones I've mentioned, and some of you like others, like At Long Last Love. There's probably a Nickelodeon fan out there. And Picture Show we should say something special about, because that film is a masterpiece. That film is more than just a classic, in my opinion. And I have watched this film and written about this film, and I've taught this film on several occasions. In my opinion, The Last Picture Show is one of the greatest American films ever made. not just of the 70s, not just New Hollywood, but of the last 120 years of American filmmaking, it's up there in the upper echelon. You know, I put it above a lot of the films that get ranked in the sort of top 10. It's one of the best American films ever made, and it was directed by Peter Bogdanovich. And I think he'll be remembered for that for a long time when a lot of this kind of personal stuff goes away. And do I hope that Polly Platt gets her due for the work that she did on that film? Yes, I do. Do I hope that she gets her credit and her due for the work that she did on his other films? Yes, I do. I wrote a book about it. But that's not to deny the sort of power of his direction on those films and the depth of knowledge that he had about filmmaking, Hollywood filmmaking, and directing performers, directing the camera. He really was a talent. He lived a long life. He was 82 years old. And if you haven't seen one of his films, I highly recommend them. I'd start with Picture Show. If you're more into comedy, start with What's Up, Doc? Paper Moon kind of blends the two, and it's got this sort of, it looks like a kind of comedy on the surface, but it's got a very nuanced but sort of dark underbelly. They're all great films. And watch his later films. You'll be surprised. They're a lot better than their reputation would lead you to believe. So rest in peace, Peter Bogdanovich. Thank you all for watching. My name's Aaron Hunter. As Bogdanovich would also encourage you to do, keep watching movies.
Have a happy time, everyone. The last verse all together. Everyone. Thank you kindly. Mrs. O'Malley, out in the valley, suffered from ulcers, I understand.
Never you mind, honey.
Grandma's nice,
Never you mind.